hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. It's going to be an interesting stream today. It's going to be an interesting stream. Opinion of psych drugs being prescribed to kids. I've already got a super chat. I haven't even started yet. Psych drugs being prescribed to kids. Psych drugs prescribed to kids. Very good. But anyway, we're going to have a stream today, and it's going to be interesting because I've got a lot of new material. I am working on a book currently that shall be coming out very early next year. I am developing some new concepts. I've engaged in quite a bit of new research. So in the process of that, I'm gonna talk to you about a few things today. It'll be things from me that I may have alluded to before, but I haven't gone into great depth about. But they are things that will be part of the new book that I'm working on. So there you go. It's going to be quite an interesting stream. We'll be discussing the pending collapse of liberalism, etc. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. If you have a super chat for me, just send it to me. I'll give my opening spiel, my opening remarks. Then we'll do the roll call, or I'll call you out as I see you, names and locations. We'll find out who it is on the other side of the camera, make this a community effort, find out who's part of our small but growing community, our close-knit group of people that are part of these ongoing live streams. House hype. We'll talk about that. House hype. And then I'll just answer your super chat questions for the rest of the night. Send me a super chat if you want to, and we'll just get right into it. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I think this will be the 313th stream that we have done on this channel. 313 streams so far. So there you go. It is Halloween here in this lovely Brooklyn neighborhood. My wife and I went and had a nice meal at an Italian restaurant. And we sat outside and we watched the costumes go by. It was pretty nice. Right? Eastern revolutions. Causes. Very good. And that was kind of fun. It's kind of cute. The neighborhood, we see the kids trick-or-treating and such. Most of the little stores in my neighborhood are giving out candy. But there was one store, and I've never seen anything like this. It had a, one of those, what do you call it? Those round, like, cones that are in, scariest historical era. One of those round cones that you have in like parking lots or whatever, and on the round orange cone that they had sitting in their door, they had the shape of a hand. They had a hand cut out doing this, and on the hand it said "No candy!" exclamation point. So they not beating around the bush at all, basically. No candy on a hand, no candy. I thought that was amusing. So that store owner is not giving out candy, but the rest of the store owners in the neighborhood were doing that. So my wife, we sat there, we watched the kids go by in their costumes. We talked about life and the weather. It's not as cold as it was yesterday. We got a relief from the wind blowing, and it's just about to be sunset here in Brooklyn. So there you go. That's how things are going. So I'm just going to jump right into our conversation for today. So one of the most important concepts in Marxism is something that Karl Marx said in his very important but very short pamphlet, The Critique of the Goethe Program. Karl Marx said, quote, "Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby." Books on Yugoslavia. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. Now, for those of you who are familiar with these streams, you'll know that that's a very important thing that we talk about on here. We acknowledge this. Many Marxists do not acknowledge this, but it's a very important point. The economic structure of society, the mode of production of a society, determines the political system of that society. under feudalism, we had subsistence farming. It was a system of subsistence farming. You had serfs and landowners, and you had that political structure because it matched the mode of production. Under feudalism, the best way to organize a society based on subsistence farming was feudalism. And if you'd gone around in feudalism and said, hey, everyone should have equal rights, and everyone should be able to think whatever they want, and people should be able to say whatever they want, people should be able to choose their own religion, people would have looked at you like you're a lunatic, because they would have said, how are we going to hold society together, right? That the mode of production, of that level of production, in feudalism was necessary in order to hold society together. And there's a reason that if Thomas Munzer had been successful and had overthrown peasant, feudalism in Germany and led the peasant uprising, if he had not been executed and defeated, if he had won in his 1525 peasant uprising, he still would have had a big problem, which is that society would still have necessitated structures that enabled production to be carried out at the subsistence farming level. There's a reason that Spartacus, even if Spartacus had succeeded in overthrowing the Roman Empire, he still would have had a problem. There would have eventually been a famine. And in order to get society working and functioning and producing enough at that mode of production in order to succeed, he would have had to develop some kind of authoritarian structure that looked something like what they had in Rome, because that's what that level of production developed. And the reason that nobody in the world started talking about the rights of man, or freedom of speech or freedom of assembly until like the 1400s or 1500s in Europe. It wasn't because people were just evil until then, and then magically they suddenly became good and recognized that people have human rights. No, the reason was that we had developed economically a mode of production that could give way to a higher level of abundance that could then structure society to have more rights, right? That right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. This is a very important point of Marxism, that you cannot build an egalitarian society in which everyone is equal unless you have created a society of vast material abundance. That hierarchy is rooted in scarcity. The reason that human beings form hierarchies is because there is scarcity. Scarcity necessitates authoritarianism. And increasing the level of abundance in society lays the basis for increasing the level of egalitarianism. And the ultimate goal is a society with so much abundance and so much prosperity that all forms of inequality can fade away. Marxism ultimately seeks to create a society in which there is so much stuff, in which people can just take what they need and do what they feel like doing, from each according to their own ability to each according to their needs. And the idea is to abolish capitalism, to abolish the system of capitalism, so that we can unleash human beings to get to that stage, right? That by abolishing capitalism and getting to a much more rationally organized economy, we can unleash the springs of cooperative wealth that Karl Marx talks about. Human labor will no longer be held back by the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market, and we can create a post-scarcity society and thus lay the basis for getting rid of all forms of inequality, all forms of social hierarchy, the very need for the state itself. That's the idea, right? And that right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. And that is, I maintain, what went wrong in the 20th century in a lot of socialist societies. In China, during the Cultural Revolution, in the early years of the Cuban Revolution with Che Guevara, in the final years of Stalin's life in Russia, they were attempting to build full communism on the basis of scarcity. The Soviet Union, they had great economic achievements. They raised that society up out of poverty. They industrialized. They wiped out illiteracy. But they still were not at the level that Western capitalism was at. But in the final years of Stalin's life, if you read the economic problems of socialism in the USSR, he's arguing that they are entering the early stages of communism. Well, they weren't, right? They weren't, because communism requires vast material abundance. But they basically were surrounded, they'd been attacked, and in order to maintain the enthusiasm necessary to continue building communism around the world, they held on to the belief that somehow they were going to be able to build communism in the USSR at that time. They weren't, right? Che Guevara and his doctrine of the new socialist man. He argued that Cuba, despite being a very poor society, despite being very underdeveloped, he argued that they could somehow motivate people to work without material incentives, that he was going to create this new socialist man that could be created, that would function on the basis of just doing what's right for society, no material incentives. Well, it didn't work very well. It didn't do very well for Cuba's economy. And eventually, Che Guevara left economic management of Cuba and he went to spread communism throughout Latin America because his economic policies weren't working. The Cultural Revolution in China, they argued, the Gang of Four that were, it's Mao's wife and three other people, they argued, they said that we can achieve a higher stage in poverty, that even though China was still poor, they could get to an egalitarian, classless, stateless world on the basis of poverty. You can't, right? And that's what Deng Xiaoping realized, and that's what Vietnam has realized, that's what Cuba has realized, and that's what socialism has adjusted for in the 21st century. They realize that right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby, meaning you can't have full communism on the basis of scarcity. You can have socialism, which is getting rid of the capitalist system. You can organize the economy more rationally, and that can help you build your country up and abolish poverty and move toward that goal. And that's what China has done. And that's why China has raised millions of people out of poverty. That's why China has been so successful in increasing technology and development, because they've abolished capitalism and they're marching ahead toward that goal of abundance. And Vietnam has had an economic miracle, according to the world praised, sorry about that, don't know what happened there. They've praised Vietnam, the World Business Forum, for its economic achievements because it's been able to create scarcity and have very high rates of economic growth because they've gotten rid of the irrationality of capitalism. And there's, Bolivia under Evo Morales, because the state was controlling the means of production under Evo Morales. They had the highest rates of GDP growth in all of South America. And they were doing it because, as the economist who was the advisor to Evo Morales explained, the commanding heights of the economy in Bolivia were centrally planned and operated on the basis of social goods. So you can have socialism in a state of scarcity. It can help abolish that scarcity. But that ultimate goal of communism, a stateless, classless world of full equality, can't be achieved until you achieve vast world of full equality can't be achieved until you achieve vast material abundance. And that is the understanding, and that you cannot impose communism. You cannot impose the breakdown of inequality. You cannot just declare people to be equal. Because if there's not a level of material abundance, some people are going to have and some people are going to have not. And there's going to be inequality, and there's going to be unjust inequality. And that the road to abolishing inequality in society is the road of creating vast material abundance. And socialism gives us the ability to create vast material abundance. That's what socialism gives us the ability to do. That's what socialism gives us the ability to do. Capitalism puts artificial restraints on production. Capitalism creates poverty amid plenty. The more efficient it becomes to produce goods, the more people are poor. Under capitalism, technological developments like self-driving cars lead to people being impoverished. But in a socialist society, self-driving cars would be a very good thing, because everyone who has to make their living driving a car can do something else, right? And you can have a higher level of abundance, right? That is the Marxist worldview. It's very different than utopian socialism, as Peter Coffin has pointed out in his great streams. Peter Coffin and Miss Astronaut Cowboy have done great streams, Peter Coffin and Miss Astronaut Cowboy have done great streams reading Frederick Engels' very important book, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, talking about this reality that that what separates the Marxist view of socialism is this understanding that socialism is based on striving to create a higher level of material abundance. It's not simply trying to declare socialism and force your egalitarian vision onto society. So the main way we talk about on this stream, we talk about all of this. The main way we talk about this is that we talk about this point that Marx makes: right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. We talk about that mainly in context of understanding socialism. However, you can understand the crisis facing our society right now, and the crisis facing liberal societies, Western liberal societies, you can understand that crisis as well. You can understand that crisis by understanding this point as well, right? We are in a period where the Western liberal societies are in a state of economic, political, and social crisis. In the United States, we don't know what we're doing anymore. We don't have an identity as a society. Our economy and living standards are dropping. Society is falling apart in the West, and the same is happening in Western Europe. The same is happening in Britain. Look at all the confusion they've got in Britain. Western liberal societies are in a state of collapse. Why are they in a state of collapse? They're in a state of collapse because right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. Same reason that socialist societies had a problem. What did the Declaration of Independence of the United States say? It said, all men are created equal. And everyone laughs about that because at the time that was written, all men were not treated equal. The majority of black people in the United States were slaves, and slaves were not treated equal, right? And it said all men because no one was thinking about women. No one thought women were equal. So at the time that Thomas Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal, it was a statement of pure hypocrisy. And that was what happened. It was a statement of pure hypocrisy. But liberalism is the ideology that comes out of the bourgeois revolutions. Liberalism is the belief in human rights, in natural rights, and it is the belief that individualism comes before all else. It is the belief that the celebration and the maximization of individual rights is what society should be focused on. That the obligation of the individual to their community and to society should be broken down. That the government is best that governs least, and that all things should be done to celebrate the individual and the individual's freedom from society at large at all costs. That individualism above all else, and that all people are inherently equal, and that therefore, as individuals, society should impose less and less on them. People should be free to just be who they are, with no obligation to society, with no restraints imposed on them, and all people should be treated equal. Well, I agree with that in premise, right? That is the ideal of society. All people should be treated equal. It's better when people are free to do their own thing and not have society telling them what to do. But what did Karl Marx say? He said, right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. We live in a very unequal society. We live in a very unequal society. There are some people who own the means of production, and there are some people who work in the means of production. There are millionaires and billionaires, and there are desperately poor people. And we don't live in an equal society. But even though we don't live in an equal society, we are walking around proclaiming that everyone should be, in theory, equal, and that everyone should be free to do whatever they want. And so liberalism is trying to impose a level of equality onto society and act and treat society like it's equal and treat society like everyone has the freedom to be whoever they are when we have an economic system that is largely unequal, when we have living standards that are dropping, we have social conditions that necessitate authoritarianism and hierarchy. But at the same time, we have an ideology that is being proclaimed from the heavens that everyone should be treated as equal. Well, I would like everyone to be equal, but the way to get there is to move to a higher mode of production. Under capitalism, no matter how much you scream it from the heavens, no matter how much you tell it to people, people are not going to be equal under capitalism. And so, after a while, when the capitalist system is proclaiming that everyone should be equal, but the economic mode clearly results in the opposite, it results in huge amounts of inequality, pretty soon those contradictions collapse on themselves, and liberalism collapses. And that's what fascism is. Fascism, and this is the most brilliant thing, I learned this from Haas, and I give him full credit. When Haas was confronted by Jabba the Bosch, what is your definition of fascism? Wah, 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 wah. What is your definition of fascism? Haas shot back with the most brilliant definition of fascism I have ever heard. He said fascism is when liberalism collapses on itself and becomes illiberal. And he's right. That is, I heard that and I was like, this is brilliant. Because that's essentially what happens. The liberal society, because it's going around telling people that everyone is created equal, it's going around telling everyone that you should be free to be who you are, but it doesn't match the mode of production. The capitalist mode of production has inherent inequality in it. The capitalist mode of production leads to society being impoverished and being held back. Eventually, capitalism, the liberal economic and political model of capitalism collapses in and of itself. And capitalism is forced by its own failures to collapse into illiberalism. And that's what fascism is. And the only way to really prevent fascism is to have socialism, because socialism moves us toward a higher state of abundance and it moves society in a direction to actually create equality. But you can't maintain capitalism and do that, right? Capitalism is going to continue to have more economic instability. The more technology advances under capitalism, the more poverty you get. Capitalism is a system where people are hungry, not because there's not enough food, but because there's too much food. The more efficient it gets to produce food, the fewer people are hired in the process of creating food. And pretty soon, people are hungry because there's too much food. Under capitalism, people are homeless not because there's not enough housing, but because there's too much housing. There's too much housing. And the more efficient it gets creating houses, the more houses that are produced, the more people lose their jobs. And pretty soon, people are homeless not because there's not enough housing, but because there's too much housing. Right? I've used many times on these lives, I've talked about the miner's riddle, the coal miner's riddle. That in Poland in the 1930s, there was a young boy who said to his father, "Father, why is it so cold?" And he said, "It's so cold because I can't afford to buy any coal to heat our home with." And the boy said, "Father, why can we not afford to buy any coal?" And he says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine, and so I don't have any money." And he said, "Father, why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" And he said, "Because there's too much coal." That's capitalism. These are the artificial restraints imposed on human production by capitalism, right? Under capitalism, people become cold in the wintertime because there's too much coal. And that's the irrationality of capitalism. Socialism is abolishing that so that the human creativity and abundance, the drive of human beings to have more than they already have, to move to a higher mode of production, is no longer restricted by the irrationality of an economy where profits are in command. And that, therefore, leads us to the higher stage. But, of course, the capitalists are not going to want to have the means of production controlled by society. They're not going to want capitalism to be abolished. They're not going to want to give up a system where they get to make profits. And so, as society faces a bigger economic crisis, and thus a bigger political crisis, and thus a bigger social crisis, they are going to have to collapse liberalism. And this is what Marx referred to as Bonapartism. Bonapartism, which is when one section of the ruling class tries to seize control of the government and use force and destruction to stabilize society. And there are different forms of Bonapartism, but the most ugly form of Bonapartism is fascism, which is trying to stabilize capitalism with an illiberal system that is actively destroying society, killing people, murdering people, reinforcing primitive medieval hierarchies, creating an authoritarian society that is driving down living standards, driving down the population, leading toward mass war, centered around war and destruction, as a mechanism for stabilizing capitalism. And when fascism collapses into reactionary illiberalism, that's fascism, right? Now, the only way to prevent fascism, which is the inevitable outcome of capitalism in a state of decay, is to move towards socialism. But they're not going to do that, so they're going to move toward fascism. And fascism, we saw what it was in Italy with Benito Mussolini. We saw what it was in Nazi Germany with Hitler. We've seen different forms of it. Fascism comes in many different forms. It comes in many, many different forms, but it's ultimately defined economically. It is an attempt, it is liberal capitalist society collapsing into illiberalism, suddenly engaging in mass destruction to reinforce hierarchies in society and try and prevent the instability that results from liberal capitalism in decay. That's what fascism is. Well, I maintain that we are in the period that we're living in right now, that the period we are living in right now is defined at this point by capitalism in decay, and we are moving towards some form of illiberalism. What we saw on January 6th with Donald Trump's supporters running around in the Capitol, that's a preview for coming attractions. That we are in the process of seeing liberalism collapse in and of itself in the West. And it's going to collapse differently, I would argue, than in the 1930s. But we can study, not just what went on in the 1930s, but what's happening now, various forms of illiberalism that have emerged. We can study what's going on. We can study what's going on in terms of psychology, in terms of economics, and in terms of organizing. We can understand what the pending collapse of liberalism is going to look like. And that's going to be the focus of my opening remarks tonight, which will be a little longer than usual because this is such an important point. The first place we need to start, the very first place we need to start, if we're going to understand the collapse of liberalism and what it will look like, is with this: Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is one of the key thinkers in the acceleration of liberalism. Sigmund Freud was the founder of psychoanalysis, which is a precursor of modern psychology. It's not considered to be scientific, right? Psychology is a social science, like sociology, like anthropology. Psychoanalysis is largely considered to not be scientific. But Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, which is a huge influence, he invented talk therapy. He invented, he's a huge influence on modern psychology, despite not being fully respected by it. Sigmund Freud was one of the key thinkers in accelerating liberalism. And in this book, Civilization and Its Discontents, is when Sigmund Freud started talking about civilization. He makes clear where he disagrees with communism in this book. It's a polemic against communism largely. It's a polemic against Christianity. It's a polemic against, social control over the individual. I'm going to summarize for you what Sigmund Freud basically believed, what he articulates in this book, which he wrote towards the very end of his life. This was like kind of the conclusion of his work, and what he believed elsewhere. Sigmund Freud basically argued that human beings, we all have impulses, right? We want to have sex, we want to be violent, we want to go to the bathroom, we want to eat, we want to crave, right? We want to be hungry and then eat. We want to have to go to the bathroom and then go to the bathroom. We want to be horny and then have sex. We have impulses. We enjoy craving things and then satisfying those cravings. That's the nature of human beings, that we crave things and then we satisfy our cravings, right? We long for something. We long to have sex. We long to be violent. We long to take a shit, and then we do it. We take a shit, or we have sex, or we punch someone in the face, and we're satisfied by fulfilling our urges. That's how human beings are. But if everyone just went around shitting whenever they felt like it, having sex whenever they felt like it, or, being violent whenever they felt like it, society would collapse, right? So we learn to control our impulses. We learn to control our impulses. That's what human beings do, and that's largely what socialization is about. When you're a child, your parents are training you and disciplining you and getting you to control your impulses and be a functioning member of society. That laws and courts and hierarchies are largely mechanisms for forcing people to control their urges and all of that, right? That religion largely serves the purpose of controlling our urges and getting us to control our urges and control our behavior. That civilization as we know it, the family structure, courts, laws, religion, all of these things are basically mechanisms that have been invented for getting people to control their urges. And Sigmund Freud argues that in a lot of ways, the way our minds work is largely rooted in controlling these urges. Great example, right? There's a story that I've heard many times. This is a very, very common story that I've heard. There's, 6-year-old kid comes home from school and says, "Hey, mommy and daddy, one of the other kids told me that Santa Claus is not real. And the mom or dad, who really enjoy the whole Santa Claus routine at Christmas time, get very angry, and they say, "How did he tell you that? Santa Claus is definitely real. How dare you?" And they get very angry. And then the child, in response to that, goes, "Oh shit, if I say Santa Claus is not real, my parents are going to get really angry with me. So I better believe in Santa Claus." And so the child may have doubts about Santa Claus, but they learn to suppress those doubts because it's not safe. Their parents will get too angry with them, will be too upset with them. They learn to suppress their thoughts. Whatever doubts they have about Santa Claus, they go deep into their subconscious and they don't acknowledge them anymore. Now, that's one version of that story. Another version of that story is, 8 or 9-year-old kid comes home from school or is driving with mom and dad after church and says, "Hey, mom and dad, how do we know that God is real? How do we know that God is real? How do we know, that religion exists?" And mom or dad, being very religious, says, "How dare you question that? There is a God. How dare you question that?" And the child goes, "Oh, wow, it's not safe for me to question my religious beliefs, so I'm going to suppress that," right? I just, whatever doubts I have about religion, I'm going to suppress them. Well, what this leads to, and this is called suppression, right? And the idea is that as we learn to be socialized, not only do we learn to control our behavior, but we learn to control our thoughts. That there are certain thoughts that we might have that are unacceptable, right? Certain desires that we might have that are unacceptable. And we learn to suppress them. And the idea is that many of our impulses, because they are so hostile to what society wants us to do, many of our impulses are so dangerous that we don't acknowledge them, that we have all kinds of desires in terms of aggression, in terms of sex, in terms of all kinds of things. We learn to suppress certain desires that we are socialized to learn are too dangerous. And so Sigmund Freud comes along and he says, even though you've learned to suppress these desires that you have that might be dangerous, you still have them. And they're still there. They're just in your subconscious. You're not acknowledging them, but they're still there. And often your mental illness is rooted in learning to suppress those desires. That because you have these desires, and you suppress them, jamming these desires into your subconscious, preventing yourself from acknowledging these desires that you have, causes you to do wacky things. These desires come out in an unhealthy way. They cause you to have fits of anger at moments that don't make sense. They cause you to have perverted sexual desires. That's, of course, Sigmund Freud was very homophobic and very transphobic, etc. They cause you to have sexual desires that are abnormal. They that by suppressing these feelings that you have, these feelings come out in ways that are unhealthy. That's what Sigmund Freud is arguing, right? And he's arguing that you have all kinds of desires and impulses that you're not aware of, that you've suppressed, and so they're going to come out in ways that are very, very unhealthy. That's what he's arguing. Well, and through his psychoanalysis, through his talk therapy, you sit down with Sigmund Freud, you sit down with a psychoanalyst, and they help you to come to terms and be aware of these feelings that you've suppressed and acknowledge these feelings that you've suppressed. And when you come to terms with it, you become healthy. That's what Sigmund Freud is arguing. And in this book, Civilization and Its Discontents, which I quoted in my book on Kamala Harris, that Sigmund Freud, he says some pretty shocking things. He says he doesn't know if it's worth it. He says maybe it's really not worth having a civilization where we train people to control their desires. Maybe it's not worth it. At the end of the day, maybe it's just not worth it. Maybe we should just have anarchy and let people do whatever they want, because look at society. We're on the brink of having World War II and fascism and communism, and maybe it's all not worth it. Maybe having a civilization, training people to control their desires, all just backfires, and it's not worth it anyway. And that's the basis. You could argue that Sigmund Freud is the first libertarian, or the first anarchist, right? The first Stefan Molyneux anarcho-capitalist. He's arguing maybe we should have a society where we don't tell anyone to do anything, because at the end of the day, we've been telling people to control their desires, and it's only gotten us up to the modern era where we have Nazis and communists and authoritarianism and all this. So maybe we should just give up on civilization. That's how his book ends. He says, maybe it's not worth it. That's Sigmund Freud. But here's the thing. At the same time that Sigmund Freud is saying we shouldn't exercise control over people, As Sigmund Freud is engaging in his psychoanalytic, practice, he's treating people for their mental illness, he realizes that he gains control over people. Transference. Look up this word, transference. Transference. That when he helps people to acknowledge their subconscious desires, when he talks with people about their most inner thoughts, when he helps guide people and allow them to come to terms with aspects of their mind that they feel ashamed of, he gains power over them. Right? Now, Sigmund Freud, he has this concept called transference, which is that as you're seeing a psychotherapist, or really as you go through life, right, the relationship that you have with your parents, right, your parents, when you're a child, you worship your parents. Your parents are the most important people in your life. They provide for you, they protect you, you're small, you have no power, they have all the power. That the feelings that you have for your parents, you spend your life going through life trying to find people to fulfill that role. That's basically what Freud is arguing, and he says that when he starts doing his psychoanalytic therapy on people, they start to transfer the feelings they have for their parents as children onto the psychoanalyst. And that the more the psychoanalyst gives them permission to feel things that they suppressed, that creates a sense of relief, right? Say the person is gay, and they've had homosexual feelings their whole life, they feel deeply ashamed. Well, they sit down with a psychoanalyst, and they tell the psychoanalyst that they have homosexual feelings, and the psychoanalyst says, wow, well, just admit that to yourself. It's okay to have these feelings. Suddenly, that person, that psychoanalyst, they admire greatly because they helped them come to terms with their feelings that they were ashamed of, and that gives the psychoanalyst a huge amount of power. Right? And the person has pent-up rage at their parent, perhaps. Their parent mistreated them, and the psychoanalyst helps them to realize they have this pent-up rage, right, that they're in denial of, helps them to come to terms with that pent-up rage, and suddenly that gives the psychoanalyst a huge amount of power. And that while Freud is arguing basically we shouldn't control people, he's also discovering that by helping people to become aware of their subconscious impulses, by engaging people and talking to them about their subconscious impulses, by making people feel better of subconscious impulses that they feel deeply ashamed of, by doing that, Sigmund Freud is able to gain a huge amount of power over them. He's able to control people, right? It's rather ironic. By lifting the constraints on social control, he's able to gain a lot of control. And so Sigmund Freud blatantly abused this. He had sex with his clients, right? Why? He had sex with them. Many of his clients were female, and after he sat down with them and helped them to come to terms with their social control, with their desires that were, he would use this influence that he gained over them to have sex with them. Right? And that Sigmund Freud was notorious for basically using transference to his advantage. Now, modern psychoanalysts talk a lot about how to maintain ethics and how to not abuse that power. That while you're giving someone psychoanalytic therapy, you gain power over them. And that's a huge amount of what modern psychoanalysts talk about. How do we not abuse this power? How do we gain this power of transference over people, but not abuse it? And that's a big debate among modern psychoanalysts, is how do we do that? And that a lot of trying to gain control over other people in the modern era, fascism, Nazism, a lot of that was rooted in this issue of using transference to gain control over other people and use them as your foot soldiers. A lot of Nazism and a lot of political movements that have developed, have been about using transference and putting yourself or your movement or your ideology in the place of a parent as a way to gain control over someone, use them as your foot soldier, and therefore, as you use them as your foot soldier, you gain control over them, and that is a way of securing political power. And Bonapartism and fascism have largely been psychologically rooted in trying to gain this kind of power over people. And there's two examples of that, right? Capitalism was collapsing in the 1920s and 30s. Germany lost World War I. Germany lost World War I, and they lost World War I. Their domestic economy had collapsed, and German society had largely collapsed. The Kaiser had stepped down. They had an attempted communist revolution in 1919 with Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht that was defeated. And German society was in a state of collapse. And at the same time that German society was in a state of collapse, there were, many people, tradition in Germany was largely fading. And Germany was the capital of social liberalism. People don't realize this. We have it in our heads that the Germans were just these right-wing authoritarian people, and that Hitler was a right-wing authoritarian, and that's how Hitler came into power. That is malarkey, okay? What happened was that Germany in the 1920s was the center of social liberalism. Because the Kaiser and the German authoritarian state had collapsed, because the communist ideology was so widespread in Germany, because there was such a strong labor movement in Germany, because there was a strong feminist movement in Germany, Germany was, while at the same time it was in a state of economic collapse, it was also the center of for example, it was the center of the gay rights movement. There was a gay rights movement in Germany. Berlin was the capital of gay rights. Gay people from all over the world went to Berlin. In Berlin, you had gay bars. In Berlin, you had drag shows. And in fact, in Berlin, there was a very big, huge building that was dedicated to the study of abnormal sexuality. Between 1900 and 1925, something like half of all Nobel Prize winners were Germans. Exactly. And Germany was a very, very liberal place, and people were exploring their sexual desires. There were drag shows, there were trans people, there were gay bars, and Germany was a very sexually liberal place. And it was a very liberal, open-minded place, full of communists, full of revolutionaries, full of artists and painters, and that's what Germany was. And there was a real danger as the 1930s set in, right? With the economic collapse of 1929, the Great Depression sets in, there was a real danger of there being a communist revolution. And in the streets of Germany, you had the Communist Party, and the Communist Party was formed, and it fought for the desperately poor and unemployed, and it was a very revolutionary party, led by Ernst Thälmann, and it was this big organization. You also had the German Communist Workers' Party, which were anarchists. You had the Social Democratic Party, which was becoming more and more reformist, and it was the party of industrial factory workers, becoming more and more non-revolutionary, and it was a very left-wing atmosphere. It was full of, you have some of the cutting-edge films. Go and see the movie Metropolis, right, which is an allegory for capitalism. Go see the film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. There's a vampire movie that came out in the 1920s in Germany. It's called Nosferatu. It's very good, starring Max Schreck. I mean, they were making cutting-edge advances in art. It was a very liberal, open-minded place with a lot of people very poor and a lot of people starving. And that was Germany. And so you had this contradiction, right? You had a very open-minded liberal society, but you had desperate poverty and suffering. So there was a fear on the part of the British Empire in particular feared a communist revolution in Germany. Right? That was the greatest fear of the British, because if Germany and Russia were to combine together, if Germany and Russia were to be on the same side, that spelled the end of British domination of the European mainland. And that has always, going back for hundreds of years, been the greatest fear of the British imperialists. They have always feared a German-Russian alliance. And the British have always been working very hard to play the Germans and the Russians against each other. Because if the Russians and Germans, right, if you have Russia and Germany, if they combined, then that basically means the British no longer have any influence on the European mainland. And that's what they fear. So, in Italy, it looked like there was going to be a communist revolution. So the British intelligence, this is a documented fact, they found a guy named Benito Mussolini. And he was a leader of the Italian Socialist Party. He was a leftist, but he supported the British in World War I. And they needed Italian communists to support World War I. So they bought him off, basically, and they paid him off. And his socialist newspaper started promoting World War I. And the British British, paid off Benito Mussolini to be a socialist who supported the war and recruited Italian socialists to support World War I. And pretty soon he started his own group called the Fascisti. The Italian Fascist Party was a group of socialists in Italy that supported World War I and were getting paid off by the British to do it. They were a counter gang. The idea was in Italy there were all these communists and revolutionaries who didn't support World War I, and so Benito Mussolini, his little group of socialists, they started getting paid by the British to support World War I in the name of socialism. And that's where the fascist movement originated. And and eventually after World War I, there was a strike wave throughout Italy. The workers were rising up and seizing their factories. So then the counter gang that the British had funded and created eventually sprouted its own feet. It went to all the Italian capitalists and said, hey, why don't we become the new dictatorship to stop the threat of communist revolution? And Mussolini went from being a British agent to being an agent of Italian capitalism and the Italian monarchy, and he created a fascist state. And in Germany, the British operatives were Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were this gang that went around beating up communists and killing communists, funded by the British, and the idea was that this was this counter gang that would prevent Germany from having a communist revolution so that Germany and Russia never combined with each other and the British could maintain their domination after World War I. And what's interesting is many people have pointed out, and this is fascinating to me, that the Nazis, before they came to power, were pro-gay, and after they took power, they killed all the gay people. It's fascinating. A lot of people will say, people on the right wing will say the Nazis were all gay. Well, and then people on the left wing will say, no, they killed all the gay people. They put the gay people in concentration camps. Both are correct. Both are correct. They weren't all gay. But before the Nazis took power, the leader of their street fighting group was this guy, Ernst Röhm. And this is the autobiography of Ernst Röhm. And he was openly gay, the leader of the Nazi street fighting group. But after Hitler took power, he killed this guy on the night of the Long Knives. And so why were the Nazis, before they took power, pro-LGBT? And then why were they against gay people after they took power? Why did this guy run the Nazi street fighting group, but then after the Nazis took power, got executed, and Hitler executed this guy? Why? What was going on there? Well, transference. Okay. Think about the 1920s. The 1920s, yes, Germany was a very liberal place, but it's a much more conservative world than it is now, to say the least, right? That's 100 years ago, right? And Germany was more advanced than the rest of the world in terms of gay rights. However, at that point, the world was a much more conservative place. So if you're trying to build a group of people that will kill communists, and will just go around murdering people and will make sure that no communist revolution ever happens, you need a group of people that are angry. You need a group of people that are really, really angry. And on top of that, you need a group of people that really like masculinity and are really into physical fitness and men and big, strong men and all that. Well, tapping into the rage of gay men was a way that the Nazis could build a fighting force that could just go around killing communists. And this gay man, Ernst Röhm, if you read his autobiography, that's what it is. This is a man full of rage. He's gay, and he grew up in a society where it was not okay to be gay, and he's very masculine, and right, he's sexually aroused by masculinity. He likes big, strong men. He likes military parades. He likes swords and fighting and strength, and he's very into masculinity, number one. And number two, he's very angry at the society around him, that he's been, he has these sexual desires that from the time he's a little boy, he's been attracted to men, and, everyone thinks he's disgusting, and no, he probably thought he was the only gay person in the world when he was a small child. And so, the rage and the ultra-masculinity of some gay men is what the Nazis and the British basically used to build their counter gang to fight against the communists. And if you read this book, it's page after page after page of him bragging about all the communists he's killed, of him just, I mean, this is an anger-filled person, an anger-filled, ultra-masculine person. He's really into all things associated with masculinity, and he's really angry at the world. And you can imagine that in the 1920s, there were probably lots of gay men who were, one, really into all things masculine, really sexually aroused by all things that were masculine, and number two, really into all, anything associated with rage, because they were full of rage, of anger at the world, of having to grow up gay in a homophobic society. And so building a counter gang, it was very useful for the Nazis to be pro-LGBT, because gay men were into the masculine aesthetics and they were full of anger. However, when the Nazis took power, it was a different story, right? The Nazis weren't, when the Nazis were, the Nazism phase one was this crazy street fighting group that went around murdering communists, okay? Gay, tapping into the gay stuff, giving gay people permission to unleash their rage, supporting the rights of gay people. That was something they could tap into in order to build their street fighting group. But when they came into power, it was very different, because the Nazis were trying to stabilize capitalism. Right? When capitalism is in a crisis, mass unemployment, you need the force of the state to try and control capitalism. You need the force of the state to try and control capitalism. And one of the main ways to control people, you have to basically get society in order. You have to control society. One of the main ways to control society is to get people to control their sexuality. If you can control people's sexuality, you can control society, right? When people have to be regulating their own behavior. And so, in order to control society, you have to get people to control their impulses. You have to tell people that they can't do what they feel like doing. You have to reassert gender norms. You have to reassert traditional family structures. That's what you have to do. So it's very different than building a street fighting group. You're trying to build an authoritarian, hierarchical, controlled society. And that is what they were trying to do. So when they're trying to build an authoritarian, hierarchical, controlled society, they have to, of course, round up the gay people and put them in prison camps. They have to reinforce traditional patriarchal structures. They have to enforce rigid sexual morality, because they're trying to stabilize and control society, right? And that's what they're trying to do. So again, you gain power with transference, but at the same time, as you're trying to stabilize society, one mechanism for stabilizing society is you have to roll back. Social liberalism is telling people you can be whoever you want to be, but capitalism doesn't work like that. Society is falling apart. So instead of moving towards socialism and enabling people to have more freedom, you have to start to stabilize society by reinforcing those social structures. So, of course, the Nazis, when they come to power, it's the opposite. It's what you can call a sexual counter-revolution, is they get rid, even though Germany was the center of gay rights, they get rid of it. In fact, there was an institute dedicated to sexual freedom. And if you see that very famous picture of the Nazis burning books, that's because they went to that institute dedicated to sexual research and they burned all the books about gay rights, all the books about homosexuality, all the books about sexual freedom. That's what they were burning, right? And part of trying to control society, trying to impose control onto a capitalist society, is rolling back the freedoms, and that it's this contradiction. Liberalism as an ideology says you can be whoever you want to be. You can do what you want to do. You're an individual. But capitalism, brought to its logical conclusion, this leads to capitalism being in a state of collapse. And so in an attempt to control an irrational, uncontrolled system, you have to try and reimpose control onto people. So they're trying to reimpose, sexual control over people, traditional values, etc. And this leads me to a point about the society we're living into, which is I argue that Me Too is a sign. Me Too is a good thing. I'm supportive of Me Too. Sexual harassment is completely unacceptable. But Me Too is an indicator that the same thing is happening in our society. Me Too is a sign that there will, basically, in order to stabilize capitalism, there's going to be a pending sexual counter-revolution. And that, Me Too is the beginning of it's a sign that there is going to be a sexual counter-revolution in the West. And that Me Too is a sign that this is happening. So what is Me Too? Me Too is against sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is a horrible, horrific thing. It's a horrible, horrific thing. But where did sexual harassment come from? No, it doesn't tie into that. Where did sexual harassment come from? Right? And people say, well, sexual harassment has always been around. That's true. People say that rape and sexual assault has happened from the beginning of time. Okay, that's true. But the culture of sexual harassment, the nature of workplace sexual harassment, what is the roots of this? All right. If you go back to the 1930s, in the law offices and in the advertising firms, there were female secretaries, but generally they were not sexually harassed. I mean, it happened. I'm sure there were individuals who raped women in their office or sexually harassed women in the office, but there was not a culture around it. How did sexual harassment become a culture? Well, it started with a lifting on sexual restraint. It started with basically, during the 1920s, 1930s, 1910s, right? If there was some guy who worked in an office and he was grabbing the secretary or touching her inappropriately or pressuring her to have sex with him, the boss would think this guy's a sex pervert, keep it at home with your wife and fire him. Right? I mean, there was no culture around it. There was no glorification of that kind of behavior. They would think this guy's a sex freak and he's being inappropriate. I mean, it was a patriarchal view. They might have viewed the guy's sexual harassment of the secretary or of a female worker at the office. They might not have viewed it in terms of violating the woman's rights. They probably viewed it in terms of he's violating the rights of her husband or he's violating the rights of her father. But there was sexual restraint. And men were expected to be sexually restrained. Women were expected to be sexually restrained. And if you were in a workplace and somebody was touching somebody inappropriately or grabbing them inappropriately, that was a violation of the sexual restraint of the traditional morality of society, and so it wasn't tolerated. The culture of sexual harassment in the workplace, it starts in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it really starts in the aftermath of McCarthyism. Right after McCarthyism was a big push. In McCarthyism, there was strict crackdowns on pornography, strict crackdowns on homosexuality. They associated it all with communism. But after McCarthyism faded, in the United States, you got the rise of Playboy magazine, right? It was in the early 60s. You suddenly have the rise of Playboy magazine, right? And if you watch the show Mad Men, about advertising culture, and suddenly you get this notion that the idea of what it means to be a cool guy was this, Hugh Hefner image, right? It's like, let your sexual impulses go. A cool guy is somebody who drinks lots of alcohol and is trying to constantly get women into bed, and he's, it's this social liberalism, lifting your sexual impulses. Well, here's the problem, right? We're suddenly saying lift sexual control, live out your sexual desires, but we have a highly unequal society. The relationship between owner, factory owner, business owner, and worker is not equal. The relations between men and women are not equal. So you're telling people unleash their sexual desires at a time when you have a society that is highly unequal. Now, that's not to excuse what anyone did. I'm not saying that at all, right? The relationship between parents and children is unequal. That doesn't mean parents are right to abuse their children. Of course not. That's obviously wrong. But when you have a situation where there is inequality among people, when men have more privilege and control over women, when women are taught less to assert their needs, when men are in business and are in positions of power, and women are not in positions of power, if you're telling society, go unleash your impulses, and some people have more privilege than others, you're going to get a lot of people that will then abuse their privilege in the process of unleashing their impulses. And what does this get back to? This gets back to right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. You have a situation where the traditional restraints on sexual impulses are being lifted, right? We're encouraging with Playboy magazine and the increasingly liberal culture. We're telling people it's okay to be more sexual, but people are not equal, right? Men and women are not equal in the workplace, and capitalists and workers are not equal. And this leads to a situation where you get men who own the company who are suddenly thinking it's okay to unleash their sexual impulses, unleashing them unconsensually against their coworkers. And you get a situation where men who are, in a privileged position and have more power at the company or whatever are using that leverage to gain sexual favors from women. And all of this is wrong. It's absolutely wrong. But it's a result of this weird matchup. You still had that inequality in society in the 1930s, but you had the traditional controls on it. Well, you strip away those traditional controls, but you don't make people equal in the process. If men and women are not equal, right? If the employer and the employee are not equal, but you're encouraging people to unleash their sexual desires, that's going to lead to a situation where there's going to be a huge increase in people abusing their power in order to satisfy their sexual desires. And that's what the problem of sexual harassment that emerged really in the early 60s. That's what it strove from. It strove from the fact that right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. And we're now dealing with the fact that we've been telling people to unleash their sexual desires while not making them equal. And so while we have an increasing amount of inequality in society between business owners and employees, while we are increasingly having a situation where people are not equal, at the same time that we're doing that, we're telling people they can unleash their sexual desires. So and that's what's happened. And Me Too was a response to that. It was a response to the fact that in a society that's telling people they can unleash their sexual desires, we had people then unleashing their sexual desires in a way in which they're leveraging their privilege and their inequality. They're leveraging their advantage in a situation of inequality to satisfy their sexual desires. And really, the only way, Me Too was the beginning, and it was great. And women were standing up and saying, we're not going to take this anymore. And Me Too, actually, when it gets down to it, had a class element to it. Because these men that were sexually assaulting the women were doing so and leveraging their economic privilege. They were the boss. She was the employee, right? And it was women standing up to the fact that men were using their male privilege and their economic privilege to pressure people and to exert sexual favors from people. And it was a very good thing. But I'm telling you, that contradiction still exists. We have a very sexually liberal society, but people are less equal than ever before. And the only way you're going to ultimately be able to correct this is with a sexual counter-revolution. Either you're going to move towards socialism and start increasing wealth and equality in society, or there's going to have to be a sexual counter-revolution. And there's no way around this, right? There's going to have to be some kind of sexual counter-revolution, or else there's going to have to be socialism. Because the Me Too is just the beginning of what's coming. When you have a situation where people are being told, pursue your sexual desires as much as you possibly can, and you have increasing inequality in society, the result is going to be people using their position to exploit people and to take advantage of people. And that doesn't make it okay. It's not trying to say it's okay. Imagine a completely different situation. Imagine that, we were as a society going around telling people to indulge their anger. Imagine we were telling society, people, indulge your anger, indulge your rage. Rage is good. Getting angry is good. When you're angry and you punch somebody, that's good. Fulfill and unleash your rage. Imagine that we were doing that as a society. Do you think the rate of child abuse would go up? Of course it would. That wouldn't mean it's okay. That wouldn't justify the parents that were doing that. But child abuse is largely parents unleashing their rage on their children. And if you start going around as a society and telling people to unleash their rage, when you have an unequal situation, children are not equal to their parents. The parents have authority over the children. As a result of that, if you're giving people permission to unleash their rage, many parents will take that opportunity to unleash their rage on their children, and it's not safe to go around telling people to just unleash their rage and be violent in a society where people are not equal. Because as a result of that, some people are going to be in a position where they can use their position to unleash their impulses in a way that is very dangerous. And this is not to justify the behavior of individuals. I'm not doing that. I'm doing the opposite. I'm telling you that if you go around and start telling people to unleash their impulses in a situation where people are not equal, the result is that people will use their position to unleash their impulses in a way that leads to inequality. And that's one of the points that I want to make. So, and there's going to have to be some kind of sexual counter-revolution. Somehow, in order to stabilize society, unless you move towards socialism, they're going to have to, at some point, start not telling people to unleash their sexual desires, because the results of people unleashing their sexual desires in a society without, in a society that is highly unequal, is people being hurt. That is the ultimate result of it. We wish that everyone would just be good. And that's what I wish. But that is generally not how it works. And in situations where people have privilege and authority over other people, they tend to abuse it. And that the sexual liberalism led to people abusing their power and abusing their authority in this way. I hope I'm making sense. I'm repeating myself because it's a complex point. But that's the way these things work. Now, that brings me to, so what do the counter gangs look like? Right? As liberalism is collapsing and they're trying to develop counter gangs, they're trying to develop, fighting forces, basically, to beat society into submission, to try and stabilize capitalism. What does that look like? Well, I maintain it looks like trauma and transference. Trauma and transference, largely, is what it looks like. And they have, since the end of the Second World War, they've developed various counter gangs. And so I'm going to talk about what the counter gangs have looked like that have been used to kind of stabilize capitalism, and how they manipulate trauma and transference in order to build authoritarian structures that are used to try and stabilize capitalism in Bonapartist schemes. So Wilhelm Reich. I've talked about Wilhelm Reich before. He's a psychoanalyst. He was, disowned by Freud, and he was a member of the Communist Party in Germany. He was disowned by the communists. Wilhelm Reich was this psychoanalyst in Germany, and he wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And the book was nuts, and it maintained It basically maintained that all of Nazism was rooted in sexual repression. That was what he maintained, that all of Nazism was rooted in sexual repression. He said that the swastika looked like two bodies having sex. He said that Hitler's speeches mimicked the orgasm. He wrote this whole book about how Nazism is turning people on in a crypto way, and that Nazism is all rooted in sexual repression. And that was nuts. And they kicked him out of the German Communist Party for writing that. Freud disowned him for writing it. And of course, when the Nazis came to power, he couldn't stay in Nazi Germany, having written a book like that. So he fled to the United States. In the United States, he became an asset of American intelligence. And Wilhelm Reich became this guy who basically, he had this little psychoanalytic cult. He was giving people therapy and telling them that the roots of all mental illness were sexual repression. And of course, he's using transference. He's gaining power over people by saying, hey, those sexual desires that you have, I give you permission to feel them. And he's gaining power over people. And eventually, he invents this silly machine called the orgone machine, it's called. And he tells people to masturbate inside this machine, and that will lead to, that'll create magical energy that'll give them strength or something. And it's just completely malarkey, and it's silly. Has postmodernism bottomed out? All right. Keep the super chats coming, folks. Keep the super chats coming. Bottomed out. And so he's in a situation where, he's gaining power over people, giving them their ability, their freedom to feel sexual desires they've repressed. He's invented this silly magical machine that doesn't really work, that they tells them to masturbate inside of, and it'll give them magical energy. And then on top of that, he actually buys a town in New England, and he moves all of his followers to this little town in New England. And he actually names the town after this magical energy that he thinks comes from orgasm. It's called Oregon, Massachusetts, or something like that. It's a little tiny town where all of his followers, who he's giving this special kind of sex therapy to, they all move to this town. And then he claims that he can talk to space aliens. And eventually, he's arrested for health fraud. The FDA says, look, you're lying. These magical machines that you claim work don't work. You're exploiting people. You're engaging in medical fraud. And so he's arrested and sent to prison and eventually dies. That's Wilhelm Reich. And Wilhelm Reich, because he was anti-Nazi, he was somebody that the U.S. government could work with in the Second World War. You know, he was kind of protected by American intelligence, but he was viewed largely as a con man and a predator. And ultimately, he's thrown in prison. He's thrown in prison because people say, look, he's committing medical fraud. Thank you, David, for the super chat. But who clearly studied, very, very closely studied Wilhelm Reich? L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. And if you look at Scientology is largely a copy. In many ways, it is a copy and an escalation of Wilhelm Reich's organization. It's largely the same thing. It has the fake machines that don't really do anything that you hook yourself up to, and it uses a practice similar to psychoanalysis, where you talk about your painful memories and you relive the trauma and the pain, and you go through it, and the space aliens, and it's going to make you healthy. It's very much, Scientology is very much Wilhelm Reich 2.0. So many aspects of Scientology are, L. Ron Hubbard studied what Wilhelm Reich was doing. He took aspects of it and he applied it to his own teachings of Dianetics. And modern Scientology is largely rooted in Wilhelm Reich. And one aspect of Scientology that you get, and it's with psychoanalysis, you get it from, Wilhelm Reich was doing this, is the manipulation of trauma. Right? When people are very traumatized, people that have PTSD, and are very badly traumatized, they're easier to manipulate. And what Scientology does, if you watch videos of Scientology, the auditing session largely works like this. The person has a very painful memory of being abused as a child, or getting robbed, or getting sexually assaulted, or, they have a painful memory. So they sit down with the auditor, and they relive it. And then the auditor says, relive it again. And the auditor says, relive it again. And they keep reliving the incident in their mind over and over and over. And they burst into tears. And they relive the painful experience. And they are basically pulled by the auditor. The auditor pulls them. It pulls them, John Steinbeck, right? It pulls them into a situation where they're just re-traumatizing themselves. That memory is becoming even more cemented over and over and over again, until finally their mind is overwhelmed by the traumatic memory that they start to have endorphins, right? They start having endorphins because they're just overwhelmed, and they start laughing. And they start laughing because they're just so overwhelmed by their painful memory. At which point the auditor says, wow, we've just cured you. And they say, cleared? And the person walks out thinking that the endorphin rush that they have is them being cured of their trauma. But they're not. It's the opposite. In fact, what they're doing is re-traumatizing them. Right. Aggression within. And the more that a person undergoes this, the more traumatized they are. The more the emotions and the pain and the PTSD surrounding these memories becomes intensified, and the more that they are able to be manipulated. And that's generally how it works, right? Is you're manipulating people's trauma. And that is generally how a lot of mind control and brainwashing works, is you take people that have some kind of PTSD, that have some kind of trauma, and you exacerbate that trauma. You get them kind of addicted to the endorphin rush of reliving their traumatic experiences. And on top of that, you get them, you re-traumatize them. So the pain and the extreme emotions that they feel, the extreme anger, the extreme sadness, the extreme desire to connect to other people, the feelings that someone who's been in a war, or the feelings that somebody who's been abused, or the feelings of somebody who, for whatever reason, you get them to relive that trauma. And it weakens them, and the heavy emotions associated with the trauma get stronger. They get kind of addicted to the process of redoing it. They develop transference for the person who's helping them relive it, because they feel attached to that person. They've shared their most inner dark secrets with them. And this is a way to exert control over somebody. And this leads to the creation of what you can call a synthetic personality. A synthetic personality, which is somebody who is so unwell that you can just push their buttons and control them. I mean, it's somebody that is just so you can push their buttons and control them. You can program them like a calculator. You push this button and you say this word, they feel this way. You say this word, they feel that way. You say this word, they feel that way. And you can play them like a flute. And that is what ultimately happens. If you take a person that has trauma and you re-traumatize them over and over and over and over again, they become addicted to the re-traumatization process. They think it's catharsis and they're being cured. Number two, you make them even more psychologically vulnerable, so their buttons are much easy to push, and you get them to the point that the mental illness flowing from their trauma is so predictable that you can push their buttons. And that method of mind control, taking traumatic people who have extreme trauma and pushing their buttons to control them, that is the way that various personalities, I maintain, various personalities that are put into positions of power, that's the way that they are selected. A great example of this is the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Have you heard of the Moonies, the Unification Church? Big right-wing cult, right? They're on the Washington Times. They're big supporters of Donald Trump. It's a big political and religious group in South Korea. And the leader of it is the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And if you read about the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, he's a lunatic. I mean, he's crazy. He is not in touch with reality. He hears voices in his head. He thinks he's the second coming of Jesus Christ. But why? Why is the Reverend Sun Myung Moon so out of touch with reality? Well, the more you look into the life of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, what he is he is a synthetic personality. He is somebody who was probably abused as a child. He's somebody who probably had more sexual desires than other people and had a huge amount of sexual desires that he could not control. And was constantly at odds with his sexual desires, and was having sexual desires he was unhappy with. He's from a very religious family in South Korea, and he's obsessed with sex. Sex flows through about everything he does. And on top of that, probably abused growing up, probably had a huge amount of sexual desires he couldn't control. And on top of that, the icing on the cake about Reverend Sun Myung Moon is that he was tortured. And he was tortured in prison in South Korea. He was tortured in prison probably in North Korea. And he was arrested in North Korea, for bigamy, for having more than one wife, which was illegal in North Korea. And he was tortured in the prison in North Korea. He was also arrested in South Korea for engaging in sexually inappropriate behavior, and he was tortured in prison in South Korea. And through the process of being tortured and having sexual desires he couldn't control, he became delusional, and he invented a story, basically, to deal with his trauma, and that story is that he's finishing Jesus' mission on earth. Jesus never finished his mission because he couldn't get married. And if you look at the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, he's a very crazy person. He's a very unwell person. He's a very delusional person. There's many people who look at the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and think, okay, this guy, he's just a con man. He's a liar. But the more you look into it, he is not, right? There's many people from his inner circle who have come out, who've turned against his religious group, and they've said, no, he believes everything he's saying. No, he really does hear the voices in his head. No, he really does think that he's a god. He staged a ceremony where, after he got out of federal prison for tax fraud, they staged a ceremony where they crowned him the Emperor of the Universe. And they had in Madison Square Garden a ceremony where they put a crown on his head and declared him the Emperor of the Universe. The man is very, very delusional, and he's very, very crazy. And that's what makes him an effective asset, right? After the Second World War, you had North Korea. It was moving, it had a communist government moving towards socialism. You had South Korea that was an authoritarian regime. And MK Ultra was going on, and they started doing all kinds of experiments about how to brainwash political communists who were arrested in South Korea, right? And they had a political re-education program for communists in South Korean prisons. And they selected the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and his religious group to be what they brainwashed communists to not be communists anymore into. And the Unification Church was set up as a counter gang that political prisoners, ex-communists who were arrested in South Korea, they would get handed over to the Moonies and the Unification Church, and they would brainwash them into his religious group. Well, why did they pick the Reverend Sun Myung Moon to do this? Why didn't they pick, some other church or some other religious group? Because Reverend Sun Myung Moon is so crazy that they know how to control him. The fact that he is so traumatized by being tortured, the fact that he's got these crazy sexual desires he can't control, and his entire religion is centered around controlling sexual desires, that he's basically, he's a synthetic personality. The Korean intelligence and the American intelligence, they know exactly how to push his buttons. Exactly how to push his buttons. They know exactly the right things to say to him. They know exactly what can set him off. He's so traumatized and re-traumatized that they know how to just push his buttons. And he's what you call a synthetic personality. And what's particularly interesting is that he appeals to people's desire to be controlled. And this is very important also. And we're talking about the history of liberalism collapsing on itself. So in Britain, following, World War I, and it really in the 1930s in Britain, society is in a state of collapse. You're having the Great Depression. You have the rise of the Nazis in Germany. And you have communism that is a mass political movement in Germany. And you have the British royal family that doesn't like communism. Most of the British ruling class, almost all the British ruling class, considers communism to be a threat to them. But then the Nazis come to power in Germany, and the Nazis are considered a threat to British society. So the communists enter like an alliance with the anti-fascist forces, and the communists are building a mass movement that is anti-fascist. And the communists are anti-fascist, and they're pro-Soviet, and they're trying to move Britain towards socialism. They're in an alliance with the liberal and anti-fascist forces. But in Britain, you also have a mass political movement called the British Union of Fascists, or the BUF, right? And it's led by Oswald Mosley, Sir Oswald Mosley. And Oswald Mosley is the British Nazi. He's the admirer of Hitler in Britain. He's a British aristocrat. He's Sir Oswald Mosley from the House of Lords. He goes to the Nazis and he likes the Nazis. He starts the British Union of Fascists. And so all kinds of men in Britain, primarily men, young men, join the British Union of Fascists. And they're called the Black Shirts. And they wear black shirts and they go around beating up Jews and beating up communists. It's a very violent group. And the group is directly tied to Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany is Britain's enemy at this point, right? Nazi Germany is refusing to pay back its British loans. Nazi Germany is moving towards seizing some of the parts of Eastern Europe that the British banks dominate. There's an inter-imperialist rivalry. Nazi Germany is trying to restore German imperialism to its previous strength, and British imperialism is threatened by it. Now, the British royal family, they kind of like Hitler, right? King Edward is forced to step down because he's dating Wallis Simpson, and she's known to be sympathetic to the Nazis. And there's a King of England, Edward VII, I believe, is forced to step down because he's known to be a Nazi sympathizer, and it's a scandal. And you have this very big Nazi group in Britain, the British Union of Fascists, headed by Oswald Mosley. So, in response to the rise of the British Union of Fascists, you get another illiberal movement that is formed, not communism, that is formed to push back against the British Union of Fascists. And what is it? What is this illiberal movement that's formed to push back against the British Union of Fascists? It's called the Oxford Group. The Oxford Group. It's headed by Frank Buckman, and he's an American pastor, Frank Buckman. He's an American minister. I think he's a Lutheran minister who has spent a whole bunch of time in China. And Frank Buckman is a conservative. He's very, very conservative, very right-wing, but he is anti-racist. He does believe people of different races should get married. He believes there should be tolerance for different religions. He's really right-wing, really conservative, really anti-communist, but anti-racist. And so Frank Buckman starts this group in Britain called the Oxford Group. And, the Oxford Group starts. And the Oxford Group is very effective in beating back the British Union of Fascists. Why? Why is it very effective in beating back the British Union of Fascists? Well, why are people joining the British Union of Fascists, right? If you want to be part of a mass movement in Britain in the 1930s, you could be a communist. There's a big communist party. There's a big communist-led labor movement. If you don't want to be a communist, you could be a social democrat. There's the Labor Party. There's all these socialist groups. You could be a Trotskyist. So why are people joining the Black Shirts? Because Communism is associated with social liberalism. Communism is associated with the gay rights movement. Communism is associated with breaking down the traditional family. And there's a layer of young men in Britain who want to be controlled. And that is one of the main reasons people join the black shirts and the fascists, because they want to be controlled. They have desires that they cannot control. They want their sexual desires to be controlled. They want their use of drugs and alcohol to be controlled. And if you join the black shirts, you're not allowed to, be sexual. You're not allowed to get drunk. It's a paramilitary authoritarian group. You live with them. You wake up every morning and exercise with them. It controls you. And so all kinds of people were joining Oswald Mosley's group because they didn't want to be on the left, because the left is associated with liberalism. But Oswald Mosley's group will discipline you and will control you. So Frank Buckman comes along and he starts his group. And his group also has a huge amount of control. You wake up every morning and exercise together. You can't drink or use drugs. You can't have sex until you're married. But they're anti-fascist and they're anti-racist. And it's a very heavily controlled group. They pull a lot from Buddhism. It's a combination of Christianity and Buddhism mixed together. They call it a new religion or whatever. It's led by Frank Buckman. And you live with them. It's for young men. They live together and they exercise together and they never have sex and they never drink. Interestingly enough, the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous were two of these young men. They were two men who couldn't control their drinking. And they wanted to be controlled. They desperately wanted to be controlled. Their drinking was out of control. So they joined Frank Buckman's Oxford group because it was a group that exerted control over you. And AA is largely derived from a lot of the practices of the Oxford group. The Oxford group controlled people by having certain mantras that you chant. That's what they do in AA. They gave you a sponsor, somebody who was like your mentor in the group, who'd been in the group longer than you, that oversaw you. And largely, the Oxford group, it appealed to people who wanted to be controlled, who wanted to be disciplined, wanted to be controlled, who felt that their life was out of control, felt they couldn't control their sexual desires, felt they couldn't control their drug use or their drinking. They joined the Oxford group, and AA is largely derived from the Oxford group. The Oxford group eventually changed its name to Moral Rearmament and said that while Britain was rearming for the war, it wasn't enough to rearm militarily. They had to rearm morally, right? And this is largely what the Oxford group was. It was an attempt to give people the control that they were looking for. And again, why would people want to be controlled, right? Most people say, I don't want to be controlled. I want to do whatever I want. Why in the world would anyone want to be controlled? For this reason. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. Let me read that one more time. That's the Marx quote that we started with. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. For this reason, right? We live in a society that says you're an individual. You can do whatever you want. You're free. You're responsible for the outcome of your own decisions, but you're free. Except we don't live in an equal society. We live in a society where some people own the means of production and some people work in the means of production. We live in a society where the capitalist is constantly trying to derive as much profits as he can from the labor of the worker, and that the capitalist is constantly trying to sell as many products as he possibly can and maximize his own profits. And so we live in a society where on the one hand, we're telling people, we're lifting the social control on people. We're not shaming people. We're not punishing people. We're letting people look at pornography. We're letting people use drugs. We're giving people more freedom than ever. But we still have a society where there's a lot of profits to be made from people not being able to control themselves. Right? If people buy lots of drugs and become drug addicts, that makes money for somebody. Look at the opioid epidemic, where doctors were being encouraged to overprescribe opioid medications. Look at the pornography industry. How much money is made from that? Right? I mean, look at the, for example, look at the sex trafficking. Look at addiction. All of this. We live in a society that really encourages people not to be able to control themselves. Now, in a more traditional and authoritarian society, people don't need to have as much strength to control themselves because society controls them. There's a social stigma on having sex outside of marriage. There's a social stigma on drinking alcohol. There's a social stigma on using drugs. Everyone's policing everybody else in an authoritarian traditional society. Well, we got rid of that. But we didn't get rid of the economic incentive. The economic incentive for you to not be able to control yourself. So we're lifting the restraints. We're making it much harder for people to control themselves on the one hand. But at the same time, we're leaving in place the economic structures that would benefit from people not controlling themselves. So of course we have widespread drug addiction. Of course we have widespread sexual behavior, people not being able to control themselves and acting out in inappropriate ways because the mechanisms of social control are lifted and there is a material incentive, a profit incentive for people to be looking at porn all day or people to be getting drunk all the time or people to be addicted to opioids. So of course we have people losing control. So it's much harder to control oneself in our society. And so you have a lot of people, and this is what's happening in our society right now, I would argue. There are a lot of people sitting there going, I want to be controlled. I want to be controlled. They're screaming, I want to be controlled. And that was what drove people to join Oswald Mosley's fascist group, as they were saying, I want to be controlled. And so to counter that, they developed the Oxford group, which was another mechanism. It was another place that people who wanted to be controlled could go without people that were afraid of their own desires, felt they couldn't control themselves. They could go to this other group in order to be controlled by it. And that way, they could have control of their own, of their desires could be controlled, right? And that's a big part of illiberalism. As liberalism collapses in and of itself, they start creating institutions that appeal to people's desire to be controlled. And that is a really, really big part of illiberalism, is creating places for people to go to fulfill their desire to be controlled, while at the same time then using them as foot soldiers for one faction of the ruling class against another. And the desire of people to be controlled, as society increasingly encourages them not to control themselves, as it's much harder to control themselves because the mechanisms of social control that society used to have are being lifted, that is a big part of the drive toward illiberalism. We are going to see more and more organizations emerge that offer people this ability. Organizations that subtly, not directly, but subtly tell people, you can join us and we will control you. The Proud Boys is a great example of this. What is the central belief of the Proud Boys? Don't masturbate. That is the central belief of the organization. Go to their Wikipedia page. This right-wing, anti-communist group that is riddled with FBI informants, they basically say, we're a group of men who don't masturbate. That's what we're about. We're a group of men who don't masturbate. It is appealing to people's desire to be controlled, right? They chant West is the best. They beat up communists, but and as society gets to the point, and thank you, Peter, I do appreciate it. As society gets to the point that people feel less and less able to control themselves, illiberal organizations will emerge that will appeal to people's desire to be controlled. And that's a lot of what's going on. Now, I wrote a whole book about Kamala Harris, where I maintain that Kamala Harris is a synthetic personality. That's what I maintain. I maintain that Kamala Harris is a synthetic personality. She's someone that they know how to manipulate. She's experienced a lot of trauma. She's obsessed with her own childhood. She sees herself as a victim. She's constantly reliving her own childhood in her mind. It's a way they're controlling her. But I want to just conclude by pointing to, now we've gone over all these historical examples. I want to point to two pieces of writing that I came across. Two pieces of writing that represent what we're going to see. And I came across both of these by accident. And and that's one thing I recommend. Don't only read books that you normally read, right? Step out of your comfort zone, please. Step out of your comfort zone. Read stuff you're not familiar with, because I learned a huge amount by reading these two books. I do not agree with them at all. These are two books I never would have read if I was only reading things I agreed with. But I accidentally came across two different books that represent illiberalism. And these are the trends of illiberalism in our society. I do not recommend these books at all, but I'm using them as a negative example of illiberalism in our society. The first book I came across was this one. I ordered it completely by accident. It's called Overcoming Monarch Mind Control by Kurth Barker. And it's bonkers. And I got it by accident. I was reading on the internet about CIA brainwashing, Project MKUltra. It came up in the recommended list, so I bought it. I didn't look into what it was. I bought it. This is nuts. This book is insane. This book is utterly insane. And it's a QAnon book. And I didn't know that when I bought it. This is a QAnon book. And basically, this guy, Kurth Barker, is an evangelical Christian. He maintains that when he's an older guy, right? He's in his 70s. He maintains that when he was a teenager, a group of satanic pedophiles kidnapped him and sexually abused him, and he couldn't remember it. He'd repressed all of his memory of it, and somehow he rediscovered it, and this group of satanic pedophiles are secretly operating underground in U.S. society, and there's all kinds of people who are walking around who were kidnapped as children and molested and raped by these satanic pedophiles, and they don't remember it. But with the methods in his book, you can come to remember the suppressed memories you have of being kidnapped by pedophiles and Satan worshipers, and you can restore your faith in Jesus Christ, and you can become, it ends by becoming, you can become a Christian nationalist. That's what he argues. You need to become, it ends with Christian nationalism, and you can support this movement that's against communism, and it's against fascism, and it supports Donald Trump. It's called Christian nationalism against the evil satanic pedophiles that have secretly infiltrated society. It's nuts. It's nuts. But you read it, you know, why is there any appeal for this? You read it, it's like, this is insane, right? He's maintaining he was molested by this, you know, secret gang of satanic pedophiles. Many Americans were abducted as children and raped by these satanic pedophile rings that exist all throughout U.S. society. But it's kind of shocking because it's using all the techniques that I've described in here to exert control over people. Number one, it argues one of the side effects that you might have of being kidnapped and abducted by the satanic pedophiles is that you might have sexual desires you're uncomfortable with. You might be gay. You might be a sadomasochist. You might have desires you can't control. You might have mental illness. And basically, it argues that, oh, are you suffering from mental illness? Oh, you are suffering from addiction. You can't control yourself. Well, that's because there's a really good chance that when you were a child, the satanic secret pedophile ring molested you, and you don't remember it. You've suppressed all your memories of it. It has a list, and again, it uses these other techniques to control you. It has the torture assessment list on page 82. And it's a list of things. It says, can you recall when you were, I'm not going to read it because it'll be a list of things that a person with PTSD would be triggered by, basically. It has a list of things that a person who has PTSD would be triggered by, a list of situations a person could be in, painful memories, and you read this list to people, and a person with PTSD will be triggered by this list. A person who has memories of being abused as a child, being sexually assaulted, being molested, you'll read this list to them, they're going to be upset. And then, if you're upset by this list, that proves you have a memory of being abused by the satanic pedophiles, and you have to join his Christian nationalist movement. He will set you free. Transference, right? He's the one who helped you understand you were molested by the satanic pedophiles. This is QAnon, right? This is QAnon. And now reading this book gave me a huge insight into the QAnon mindset, right? It's people dealing with their own trauma, with their own PTSD, with their own desire to be controlled by telling them, you were molested by satanic pedophiles, you have no memory of it, but we can help you understand it, and we need a Christian nationalist movement to fight against it. That's QAnon. Reading that book and I'm sure he believes what he's saying. I don't think he's a liar. I think Mr. Kurth Barker probably believes every word he's saying here, but it's bonkers. But it's something that could appeal to people, right? It could appeal to people. If someone has a lot of pain, if someone has a lot of desires and feelings they can't control, if someone is struggling with mental illness, if Kurth Barker sat down with them and read them that list, and they suddenly started having a wave of emotions in response to things that they remember, he could gain a huge amount of control over them, and they would join his Christian nationalist movement. And this is what liberalism collapsing in and of itself is going to look like. It's going to look like this. Another book I came across totally by accident. It was sent to me, a friend recommended this. He said, you got to check this out. This is something nuts. So Edward Dutton, do people know who Edward Dutton is? Edward Dutton is a white supremacist who works with Richard Spencer. He's into racial pseudoscience, and he has a YouTube channel. He's all about genetics and racial pseudoscience. Edward Dutton wrote this book, Churchill's Headmaster. And it is called Churchill's Headmaster, the Sadist Who Nearly Saved the British Empire. And this book is deranged. And it basically is an argument that, Winston Churchill, the leader of Britain during the Second World War, in all of his biographies and autobiographies, they talk about this teacher that Winston Churchill had. And this teacher that Winston Churchill had, Edward, I forget, what was the guy's name? I don't remember what the name was. I read this book, not the kind of book I would ever read, but this teacher that Winston Churchill had, what was his name here? I'm going to pull up the name. This teacher that Winston Churchill had was a cruel, abusive teacher who beat him and derived sexual pleasure from beating Winston Churchill. And that, Winston Churchill's biographies talk about how he was abused by this headmaster, this teacher. Sneyd Kneersley is this teacher that Winston Churchill had, who was a sexual pervert who enjoyed beating him as a child and spanking him, basically, and derived sexual pleasure from it. And, this book is called Churchill's Headmaster, the Sadist Who Nearly Saved the British Empire. And Edward Dutton, the associate of Richard Spencer, the white supremacist, the racist, is arguing that, yes, Winston Churchill's headmaster was a sexual sadist who enjoyed spanking children and took pleasure in it, but that's a good thing. Now, I don't know how anyone in their right mind could write such a book, but he argues that this is a good thing, and that many teachers, he argues, in Britain were like this back in the day, and they were beating students for their sexual pleasure, but this is a good thing. This is a good thing because it toughened the young men up and helped them become powerful. It's nuts. This is insanity. Who in their right mind would think that that teachers beating students for their sexual pleasure is a good thing? I don't know anyone in their right mind who would think that that's okay. Oh, wow, teachers punishing students for their sexual satisfaction is a good thing. That's nuts. That is absolutely nuts. But who would this appeal to? Someone trying to come to the terms with the abuse that they suffered. Someone trying to make sense of feelings that they have that they cannot control. This is again appealing to people's trauma, trying to get people to deal with their trauma. It's transference, right? This is particularly scary. So this is what we're going to see. Liberalism is collapsing. And for those of you who haven't been here since the beginning, welcome. I'm just going to continue talking about what I'm talking about, and then we'll do the roll call. But basically, I maintain that liberalism is in a state of collapse, that society is coming apart, and that because of the capitalist system, because of the fact that profits are in command, because of the fact that as the capitalist system becomes more and more efficient and it becomes easier to produce goods, millions of people no longer have a place at the assembly line. They cannot buy the products that are being produced. Soon the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. Because of the fact that the computer revolution has escalated the capitalist mode of production to extreme lengths, that capitalism is in a state of crisis, and that the capitalist mode of production, founded on the liberal thinking, with the idea that everyone can be the individual they want to be, that no one has any obligation to anyone else. We're in a societal crisis, and it's falling apart. And so liberalism is in the process of collapsing in and of itself, of moving towards some form of illiberalism to preserve the power of the capitalists. And what happened in the 1930s in Nazi Germany and in Italy, and what happened all throughout the Western world as there was a crisis of capitalism in decay, has come back around again. The cycle of capitalist crisis is once again back around, and that basically liberalism is in the process of collapsing into illiberalism. And that illiberalism is going to emerge. It's going to be manipulating people's trauma and transference. It's going to be appealing to people's desire to be controlled. It's going to be appealing to people's trauma. It's going to be trying to adjust for the fact that right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and the cultural development conditioned thereby. And that this is what is going to happen as capitalism is in a state of collapse. Now, I've hit you with a lot of information there, and I hope it wasn't too overwhelming, but this is basically what's happening. The only way out is socialism. The only way out is for the banks, factories, and industries to be organized to serve public good, not the profits of a few. The only way out of this crisis of liberalism collapsing into some kind of deranged authoritarian illiberalism, the only way out of this is for us to have a rationally controlled economy. Society as a whole must take control of the means of production. We need to not be reinforcing feudal hierarchies. We need to not be reinforcing inequality. But instead, we need to move toward a society where people can be equal on the basis of vast material abundance. And the means of production, the centers of economic power, can be reorganized to serve public good and not the profits of a few. And as a result of that, of society being rationally organized, we can raise productive forces and lead to a society where people have an economic opportunity, where real equality can be realized from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. And that concludes my opening remarks for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Names and locations, I'll call you out as I see you. And now I'm going to start answering super chat questions. Woo! Lots of information there. How are folks doing? We got Zachary in Richmond, Virginia. We've got JT24 in Mississippi. We've got Cleveland Pirate Alex, Micah in Las Vegas, Oakland, Kevin Silver, Dylan Small in California, Orestes in Florida, Alan in Chicago, Halliburton, Ontario, Wisconsin, Nick in California, West Virginia, John in Houston, Leipzig, East Germany, Finland. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. San Angelo, Solidarity, Texas, Athens, Greece, Greenville, South Carolina, Mobile, Alabama. Greetings from Chicago, Jason Hunt, Montgomery, Alabama, Noel in New Zealand, Vinicius in Brazil, Quinn and Meredith in Eatonville, West Virginia, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, Uncle Albert in London, UK, the Netherlands, Ben in Denver, Bill Davis in California, Nelson from San Antonio, Texas. Welcome, Nelson. Auckland, New Zealand, Milky Way. Presently at the World Trade Center, says Red Illuminati. I suppose you're giving a tour. Cincinnati, Ohio. Great opening remarks, Caleb, says Jenny Lynn. You're very welcome. Tucson, Lagos, Bermuda, Detroit, Michigan, North Dakota, Brian Schaefer, Maine, USA, Netherlands, Tucson, Arizona, Boulder. Hi, Caleb, says Hope Renee. Shout out to you, Hope Renee. The Vale Between the Worlds, Texas, says Alex. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Fort Lauderdale, says Craig. Bondbridge, Scotland. Nate in Chicago. We're going to move the camera here so I can get into a more comfortable position. Amazing intro, LP. Yeah, I hope I didn't hit you with too much information there, but it's basically a lot of the insights into what liberalism collapsing will be like. I hope people liked it. So there you go. And that'll be much more clearly put in my upcoming book, which I'm working on if I ever get a chance to just sit down and write it. I'm doing so much these days. Vinicius, very good. Bob in Central New Jersey. Welcome, Bob. Right? Big Al in Chichester, New York. Big Al. Who else is with us tonight? Naples, Florida. Martin in Ireland. Where else? Mo in Toronto, Canada. Mo in Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Mo in Toronto. Who else is with us tonight? Who else is with us tonight? All right. Alrighty. Finn in Duluth, Minnesota. Who else is with us? Nick from Minnetonka, Minnesota. Carolina Beach. Hugo in the Netherlands. Happy Halloween, good folks. Boulder. Alex Gunn in Boulder is with us tonight. Who else is with us tonight? Who else is with us tonight? There we go. Anybody else with us tonight? Anybody else with us tonight? Salish C. Julian from Texas, consulting Marxist. All right. Grand Canyon is with us. Or you're in the Grand Canyon, rather. Who else is with us tonight? Anybody else? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Happy Halloween. Jabba the Vosh from Beverly Hills. I really doubt it's really you, but that's good. I enjoy the sarcasm. Hi from Pittsburgh. Great opening. We'll listen to the rest tomorrow. Dallas, Texas. Jamie Gray. Welcome, Jamie Gray. There you go. Zurich from Switzerland. Jacob Levy. So there you go. All right. All right, folks. Reese from Adelaide, Australia. Mike in North Carolina is with us. Reese, there we go. Anybody else? Anybody else? Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. All right. I guess not. So now I'm going to start answering people's super chat questions. Just a Zephyr from Eugene, Oregon. Shout out to you, Zephyr. I'm going to shout out, I am going to mention, by the way, that... all right, there we go. Dylan Small is creating a reading group. That's pretty cool. So there you go. All right, but I am going to mention, folks, that if you want to be on our patrons-only stream that's happening tomorrow evening, you can sign up. That's a business announcement. You can sign up for the patrons-only stream. That is happening. That'll be happening. Kinky is here. Shout out to you, Kinky. You're in Joshua Tree, I believe. You can sign up and be on the patrons-only stream. That is happening. If you want to send a one-time donation to help with the trip to Nicaragua that the John Brown Volunteers are conducting, our delegation that's happening, you can send me a PayPal donation at calebmaupin@gmail.com. That would be greatly appreciated. Chaya in Montreal, I knew you would speak up finally. I'm in a call with a friend, so coming and going. Well, that's okay, Chaya. That's okay. Welcome. Glad to have you here. But yeah, if you want to help us out that way, that'd be great. And now I'm going to start answering super chat questions for the rest of this stream. So, first super chat question. What about psychiatric drugs being prescribed to kids? Well, look, okay, I am not inherently opposed to them. I'm not inherently opposed to them, right? There are some children who are in circumstances where, it makes it easier to live, right? By giving them, SSRIs, giving them drugs. I'm not a doctor, okay, first of all. I'm just telling you that there are probably situations that children are in. There are probably children that are unhappy, that giving them psychiatric drugs may make their lives easier. But at the end of the day, what I believe, and again, I am not a doctor, I'm not giving medical advice here, I'm just giving you my personal opinion, is that while those drugs may make circumstances easier for children, it may make the children behave a little bit better, it may calm down, but the problem usually is not biochemical. And that's one of the problems with modern societies. We maintain that all the illnesses people suffer are all just biochemical. And I don't maintain that 1 in 5 people has a biochemical imbalance causing them to be depressed, right? I maintain that there is something in our society that is leading people to be depressed. And I don't maintain the number of kids that are being put on Ritalin and being put on, psych meds of various kinds, little children, and there's something wrong in our society. And often, there's something wrong in their relationship with their parents. There's something wrong in the way they're being educated, in the way their schools are being set up, that there are bigger problems than simply a biochemical imbalance. Now, that's not to say, though, that it may be a situation where putting them on the drugs, it's a way to, it's a Band-Aid, basically. It's a way to make it easier for them to get through some hard times. So I'm not saying it's necessarily evil or wrong. It's not the answer, though. And it's predicated on the illusion that somehow whatever problem the child is having is simply rooted in a biochemical issue, and that it's more than that. And, it could be the school, could be their family. There's more going on than that. And that, okay, there might be circumstances where it could improve things, but it's the problem. One of the best lines I ever heard was Stephen Colbert. Back when, not his late night show, but back years ago when he had the Colbert Report, where he was this sarcastic right-wing commentator. It was like making fun of Bill O'Reilly. Stephen Colbert on his show On his show, he actually had a line. He was pretending to be a right-wing commentator, and he was saying, "I love these drugs that children are being put on now. It used to be when children misbehaved, we spanked their bottoms, but now we can spank their minds." I thought that was a good line because that's, I mean, the drugs potentially could do long-term damage. We don't know, but putting people, especially on heavy medications for a very long period of time, is not necessarily good for them. And that, again, there may be circumstances where it helps, where it's necessary, but overall, the problems that these drugs children are being put on, someone in the chat said chemical lobotomy, the problems that parents and teachers are putting kids on drugs to address are generally not rooted in biochemical issues, right? And because of that, because they're not rooted in biochemical issues, trying to address it simply by giving them drugs is not really going to solve the problem. It's going to be a Band-Aid. It might calm the child down. It might help the child focus a little bit better in school, but the issue is deeper than that. And that's really my point. And again, I'm not a doctor, right? And I'm not please nobody hear this and say, "Oh, Caleb said I should," no. Don't, Caleb said I should take no, I didn't say that. Caleb said I shouldn't take no, Caleb didn't say that. Caleb said in some circumstances it might be good, but most of the time, even if it is necessary or it's a temporary fix, the issue is deeper. That's what I said. Don't take it out of context because, you put me in an awkward spot here. I'm telling you my opinion, which is most of the time when a child is put on drugs, it's addressing a problem that drugs won't really solve. Okay? That's all I said. But don't take it out of context. Don't say, "Well, Caleb said this," or "Caleb said," I didn't say that. I didn't say that. And that's it's always a risk. I worry about that opening stream I just gave now. There's plenty of things I said in there that people could take out of context, and they will, right? And that's one of the dangers of talking about this kind of thing. Is that I talked about a lot of stuff in there. I talked about Freud. I talked about Nazis. I talked about, the gay rights movement. I talked about Me Too. And everything I said there's a way that somebody could twist it into something I didn't say. And that's what these scum do, right? There's a certain person who took my BreadTube book, and I swear he didn't understand a single point I made. But I think he's just a liar. I think he just lied because every single thing I said in that book, he found a way to twist it into something I didn't say, and say, well, what he means is this, and that's right. And it's like he claimed that I was attacking somebody as homophobic for supporting Chelsea Manning, which is not what I said. He claimed that I said every single person on YouTube who disagrees with me is a CIA agent, which of course I didn't say. And it's like they just lie. When people lie that blatantly, right, if you talk about any topic, they can take what you said and they can distort it into something completely different. And that last stream I just did, I talked about all kinds of very sensitive issues, and someone could take what I said and say that I'm saying sexual harassment is okay, which is not what I said. It's the exact opposite of what I said. People could take what I said and say that I said Nazis were gay, which is not what I said. I talked about how they murdered all kinds of gay people, but their politics shifted. People could take what I said and say that people could say all kinds of stuff. And that's not what I said, right? But this is how these people operate, is they take things that I say and they make it sound like I'm saying something completely different, and then they attack me for saying what I didn't say. They can't make one single honest argument. The way that these breadtubers operate is they have a list of things the alt-right says, and that's their only political education. They have a list, Steve Hassan or somebody handed them a list of things that the alt-right says that it's their job to refute. So they watch my videos, and I'm not saying what the alt-right says, right? I just ripped the alt-right to pieces. I ripped Edward Dutton, who is the alt-right, white supremacist, white nationalist, whatever. He just ripped him to shreds for his disgusting book. I ripped to shreds a QAnon book, but they have a list of things the alt-right says, and then they take that, and then everyone they don't like, they find a way to reinterpret what they said to be something on that list, and then they argue with it. It's because these people have no understanding of Marxism. They have no understanding of world politics. They just know alt-right is bad. My job, the reason the algorithms love me, the reason I'm getting lots of money in my Patreon is to refute alt-right. I am part of an operation to refute alt-right. And so it's like everyone they disagree with must somehow secretly be on the alt-right. If you're a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail, basically. That's the way these people operate. If you're a hammer, then the whole world looks like a nail. And that's the situation that we are in. If you're a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And so they don't have any understanding. As far as they're concerned, they're a hammer and the world is nails. And there are other hammers and then there are nails. And that's how simple it is. And it's not. The world is much more complicated than that. And I'm trying to actually educate my audience and get my audience to actually understand stuff. And they're not interested in doing that. So there you go. Alrighty. Next question. The house hype. I'm not living in a house. I live in an apartment with my beautiful wife, and we live in an apartment. We love each other, and there are two of us who live here, not a bunch. So I don't know where people get this from, but I mean, this is silliness, right? This is so silly. And I mean, I honestly wonder, the person who initially tweeted that out, like, retracted their tweet, and it's just, this is, it's a stab in the dark. It shows how silly these people are, right? I joked, I said, does Alexander Dugin live in the house also? I've met Alexander Dugin a total of one time in my life. I respect him as an anti-imperialist intellectual, but we don't agree. He's got a traditionalist conservative view, and I have a Marxist left-wing view. But I respect him as an important anti-imperialist figure in Russia. And that's that. That's all there is to it. But people say I'm frequently, no, I'm not. I'm not frequently. I am a Duginist. I'm not. No, and it's like, well, now I live with Hinkle and Haas. No, I don't. I don't live with Hinkle and Haas. I live in Brooklyn, in my lovely Brooklyn apartment with my wife and no one else. And this is where we live. And there you go. So, yeah, there you go. All right. The Eastern European revolutions of 1989 to 1991. What were the causes? Well, I mean, here's the thing. All right, there's a couple factors. Again, with every historical event, you can't just say there's one cause. Right? You can't just say that there's one cause for a historical event. Often there are many causes for historical events. Often historical events have many different factors contributing to them. But the primary factor in the fall of the Eastern Bloc was manipulation of various forces by imperialism, right? That there were big problems in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc, right? And so that was one factor, was the problems. But the problems alone would not have led to the overthrow of socialism. But the imperialists were able to then manipulate those problems to the point that they brought down the socialist governments. And that's the issue there. One of the big factors was that there were a lot of intellectuals in Eastern Europe who felt stifled and suppressed, and that there was not much room for social mobility, that within the Eastern Bloc, that people who wanted to get ahead and start their own business, or people who were creative, they were just kind of stuck in some government bureaucracy job, and they just worked in that government bureaucracy job. That was one problem that they had. They had another problem, which was that they were barricaded economically, and as a result of that, they were barricaded. They had another problem, that these societies were very authoritarian because they were under constant military threat, and they developed a military authoritarian structure. Another problem that they had, one of the major factors, was that amid all these problems, people that were frustrated they didn't have the level of free speech that they wanted, people were frustrated that they couldn't start their own business and get rich. In addition to that, you had the CIA and George Soros and American intelligence manipulating all of that and changing what it meant to be a leftist. And so it was a long process of, the weaknesses of the Soviet Union and of the Eastern Bloc. Those weaknesses were manipulated. Another factor was, and this is a factor in the fall of the Soviet Union, was that Lenin and the Bolsheviks really emphasized national differences. They were really into promoting oppressed nationalities and promoting the languages of oppressed nationalities and promoting the idea that throughout the Eastern Bloc and throughout the Soviet Union, there were many different nationalities. Well, if you're emphasizing people's differences, that leads to a situation where people resent other nationalities now, doesn't it? Right? And it leads to a situation where people are going to be remembering how they're different and not what they have in common. And that's one factor as well. There was a national question to it, right? Now, it's important to note, though, that the vote to keep the Soviet Union was much higher outside of Russia than it was in Russia. And that the fall of the Soviet Union was bad for Russia, but it was really bad for little tiny countries in Central Asia and places like that. It was far worse for them because they had nothing. It was their relationship with Russia that allowed them to industrialize and all of that. But that said, the Soviet Union and the communists did have an emphasis on national differences. And as a result of that, the differences between the various nationalities of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were emphasized by communist politics. There were many factors. There was a national issue. There was the problems that you have in the Soviet model, the Soviet economic model of socialism without a market sector. There was big problems with that. There were big problems because they were militarily under threat. And on top of that, all of those problems were manipulated by American intelligence. And all of that culminated in the overthrow of socialism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And just like every historical event, there are many causes. And that's what I explained in my recent stream. And someone asked me, well, what would you do if you could go back in time? No, right? Every event is tied into so many other events. You can't do that. You can't do that, folks. You can't just sit there and be like, oh, well, I would go back in time and stop the assassination of Kennedy. No. The assassination of Kennedy happened for a number of reasons, right? It wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald. There was, the fact that he was in Dallas that day. There's the fact that, Lee Harvey Oswald was there. There's the fact that this happened. There's the fact that that happened. I mean, there's so many different factors in making an event happen. You can't just be like, well, what if that didn't happen? If that event didn't happen, everything would be different. Everything would be different, right? Everything would be different. So you can't play that hypothetical. You can't, right? And the more you try to do that in your mind, to play that hypothetical, it becomes a rabbit hole that you get stuck in, because at the end of the day, you don't really know, because everything would be so completely different. There are so many factors there. You can't do that. So I'm telling you why the revolutions of Eastern Europe happened, and that's the reality. Next question. The scariest historical era. I would say the scariest historical era was the fall of the Roman Empire. Right? The Roman Empire was a reactionary society that was holding back historical progress, but it collapsed. It collapsed, and it did not result in a higher form of civilization emerging. It took Europe 1,100 years to get back to the population level it had at the height of the Roman Empire. You want to talk about bad times. The human life expectancy went down by decades. The human height, the average height of a human being, went down by inches. The fall of the Roman Empire was one of the greatest economic disasters, economic, political, and civilizational disasters in history. That's not to say the Roman Empire was good. The Roman Empire was pretty bad, but it collapsed into something that was even worse, right? And that is my fear about Western civilization. My fear is that if we don't develop the city-building tendency here in the West, instead of the West, falling into something better, instead of us moving toward a glorious socialist society, what will happen is it will be like the Roman Empire. We'll go from this, and this is bad, to the Wild West. We'll go from this to Mad Max. As bad as this is, right? People don't like this. There's lots of inequality here, lots of economic inequality. People don't have jobs. People don't have health care. The roads are crumbling. You don't want Mad Max. And that's my fear, right? Is that Roman civilization was very bad. But then when it collapsed, you got the year 1000 version, the first millennium BC or AD version of Mad Max. We don't want Mad Max, okay? We really don't want Mad Max, all right? You think look, we're heading into the holiday season right now. And I was walking through my neighborhood today, with my wife, and I was looking at stores, big empty shelves. There's a store in my neighborhood where they sell like household goods or whatever. Big empty shelves. People are getting ready for, Black Friday this year is going to be pretty wild because there's not stuff. In my neighborhood here in New York City, this shocked me. I went to go to the ATM because I needed some cash. Went to the ATM, huge line at the ATM in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm like, what in the world? What in the world is going on? Why is there a line at the ATM in Brooklyn, New York? Why was there a line? Because one of the ATMs wasn't working. One of the ATMs was working at full capacity, and the other ATM only had $1 bills in it and could only give you up to 50 $1 bills. And so there was a line of 14 people waiting to go to the one ATM that worked. One of the ATMs was out of cash. One of the ATMs could only give you $1 bills, and there was one working ATM. That's a little scary, folks. Now, isn't it? Isn't that a little scary? I think that's a bit scary. That is a little bit scary. I've never seen a line at the ATM on Sunday, in New York City. And all the empty shelves I saw, folks, you think it's bad now. It is. It's bad now, right? It's bad. A lot of people are out of work. Living standards are dropping. People are hungry. It could get worse. It could get a lot worse. It could get a lot worse. A great example of this, right? In the Dominican Republic right now. The Dominican Republic is a free market capitalist society. It's a capitalist country. It's aligned with U.S. imperialism. It's been economically looted by American corporations. People are very poor. All across the Dominican Republic, there's many people who admire the dictator Trujillo. How in the world can anyone admire Trujillo? Mass murderer, committed genocide against Haitians, authoritarian strongman for U.S. imperialism. There's a lot of people in Dominican Republic right now that are like, hey, at least when Trujillo was there, we knew who was in charge. It wasn't utter chaos, He killed drug dealers, like he executed murderers. And it's like when society collapses into Mad Max stuff, people go, wow, at least, the most brutal authoritarian state was better than this. And generally that's what you get. The Mad Max stuff only lasts for a while, and then you get a brutal authoritarian state. And that's my fear. If we don't, imagine, well, no, I mean, I almost did that thing I told you not to do, but if we can get the city building tendency together, and start rebuilding the United States on socialist lines, it won't be Mad Max, it'll be the opposite. It'll be a highly organized society where people are getting richer, where we're trading with other countries on the basis of win-win cooperation. It could be very beautiful. But if, liberalism collapses into illiberalism, and then that illiberalism collapses, which is what ultimately happens, right? That's what, the illiberalism eventually will collapse. Out of that will come Mad Max, right? And this is what Rosa Luxemburg wrote about socialism or barbarism. She said that Marx, he was not correct when he said that, socialism is inevitable, right? And she used the example of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire did not get replaced by a higher system. It collapsed into barbarism. And that's what could happen to Western civilization. And if we don't move towards socialism, we could simply collapse into barbarism. And I feel like there's a good chance that might happen, right? And that socialism, that we could just have a global shift, basically. The West will collapse into barbarism, and we'll see the rise of Eurasia. And that's great. And we'll have barbarism and chaos. We'll be the new third world. And Eurasia will become the new first world. And do you want that? I don't want that. And Eurasia doesn't want that. Russia and China don't want that. That wouldn't be good for anybody, right? That's not what we want. We don't want our country to turn into the Wild West. We'd like our country to rationally move towards socialism, right? That's what we would like. And really, socialism is the only way out of this. But if we collapse into illiberalism and then into the Wild West, that's a nightmare, right? And there's already talk of states in the United States, secessionist movements, that. And, again, that's laughable now. Wait until, we collapse into some form of illiberalism. It won't be so laughable. If the USA were to adopt some kind of fascist system, I could very easily see secessionist movements in California, that, or in Texas or in Vermont take off, and armed struggles breaking out, and local warlords running cities. And we think it's bad now because there's not stuff on the shelves. Just saying, right? Again, I don't like to be this kind of person, but we have to get optimistic, constructive socialism out there. We have to get optimistic, constructive socialism out there, because if not, we're going to see the collapse of liberalism into illiberalism, and we're going to see insanity, and we're going to see the Wild West, and that's what we don't want. We don't want the Wild West. We don't want the Wild West. I did debate a libertarian one time who thought that the Wild West was a good thing, and I was in utter shock. I was in absolutely utter shock. This libertarian, I debated the head of the Libertarian Party, mind you, not just any libertarian. You can watch our full debate. I debated this libertarian, and he said that the best time in American history was the Wild West, was the Old West, and he also said that the best example of capitalism was the local pot dealer. So his idea of a good time in American history is the Wild West, and his idea of capitalism as its finest is the illegal drug trade. how do you deal with that level of stupid? I don't know. I went on about the Soviet Union industrializing and raising people out of poverty, and he said he went to the Soviet Union in the 80s and they didn't have food he wanted in restaurants. I mean, it's just this libertarianism is idiotic to me, but there you go. But that's what happens when you separate politics from economics. You get people that are libertarians, right? When politics just becomes, I want to have freedom. Freedom is this abstract value. Freedom is not connected to the mode of production. Freedom's not, connected to, anything in the wider society. It's just freedom is good. People should have freedom. I like freedom, man. Don't you like freedom? That's what you get. You get libertarianism. And libertarianism, that's what you get. All right, books on Yugoslavia. To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti is very, very good. War, Lies, and Videotape, published by the International Action Center, is very good. There's a couple other books the International Action Center published on Yugoslavia, but in terms of like a narrative history of Yugoslavia and the collapse of Yugoslavia and the fall of Yugoslavia, I would recommend To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti. That's what I would recommend. All right. Has postmodernism bottomed out? Good question. Good question. Not yet. I think it will eventually, but right now there is a faction of our society that is very, very committed to it. So we shall see. But postmodernism is still the prevailing viewpoint of the Eastern establishment. The belief that there is no truth, that any attempt to impose truth is authoritarianism, that deconstruction is the only moral thing that a philosopher can do. There's still a very, very powerful axis within our society that's committed to that. And we shall see. What do I think of John Steinbeck? Well, I love his writing. The Grapes of Wrath is tremendous. The Pearl is tremendous. John Steinbeck, I generally like his work. Good writing. The Grapes of Wrath is a great example of social realism. Great example of it. So there you go. But I'm starting to run low on super chats, so if anyone has anything else they want me to talk about, now would be the time. But there you go. Can we tap into the aggression within the working class to channel it for the revolution? That's generally not, yes, to some degree. Obviously there are going to be circumstances where that happens, but the main thing that should be our desire is we should want people to be as aware as they can possibly be. We should want people to be as aware of their own feelings and their impulses and to act as rationally as possible. We should never be trying to manipulate people. We should never be trying to use people as synthetic personalities. We should generally be aiming to build a more healthy society, not a less healthy one, right? We should be generally aiming to help the working class become aware of their conditions, help them become conscious of their own actions, help them to function in a coherent, rational way, not trying to push their buttons. And, we shouldn't want to be trying to manipulate the working class as synthetic personalities, right? Because in the long term, that will ultimately defeat our ultimate purpose, right? We're trying to empower people, not trying to manipulate and rule over people, right? So we should ultimately be trying to unleash people and get them to a higher state of being. There may be circumstances where, in the short term, people's anger is going to be released. How is China making it hard for the imperialists to fund a new labor aristocracy? Well, here's the thing. The main factor destroying the labor aristocracy in the United States is not a lack of money. The main thing is that there is not a need for them in production. The labor aristocracy in the United States was largely industrial workers. It was largely industrial workers. And those industrial workers were, thank you, Don, for your super chat. It is very much appreciated. Thank you very, very much. And shout out to you, Don D. The basis of the labor aristocracy is largely that the capitalists need a layer of well-paid workers in industry in the homeland to produce their goods. At this point, they don't. At this point, they don't need a layer of well-paid workers in the homeland to produce their goods. They don't. They have no need for them. It's the computer revolution, I would argue, that is the main factor in getting rid of the labor aristocracy. Part of it is also that technology has made it easier to ship products, and like a single computer can be produced in like 15 different countries. So technology has made it easier for them to produce different goods, but technology has also eliminated the role of the worker in production. And I would argue those are the main factors. There is still a lot of production in the United States. Weapons and military hardware is overwhelmingly created in this country. Many people do not realize that, but there is a huge amount of military production here still. But they don't need workers to do it. They got machines to do it. Thoughts on Seymour Hersh's The Samson Option? I haven't read it. Seymour Hersh is a very important journalist who has exposed a lot of the crimes of U.S. imperialism. He came to prominence during the Vietnam War. I have a lot of respect for Seymour Hersh and for his work. But I have not read that particular work that you are referencing, so I can't comment on that. So there you go. But if there's anything else people want me to mention, go ahead. Now is the time. Be well in Nicaragua, says Olympian Logic. We will be well in Nicaragua. All right, folks. Well, I am going to be back online tonight. I am going to be back online probably 10:30 or 11. I'll set up the stream when I turn this off and find out what time it is and how much time I'm going to have. I'll be back on. I'm going to do one more live tonight because it's the end of the month and I want to go out of this month as strong as we possibly can. So I'll be back later tonight. It's been a fun stream. That opening, that was a lot of new material on my part, a lot of the culmination of a lot of research. Your feedback is appreciated. I always do read the comments. Just heard NPR trashing Nicaragua. Well, there you go. I always do read the comments, so feedback on that material would be helpful. There's a lot of new concepts I've been working on, a lot of new research I've been doing over the years. But I'll be back later tonight, and give me your comments on all of that. But we'll be back later tonight. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.